When we talk about the redemption, or the lack thereof, for the collector, first we have to talk about what we mean by redemption. The word is thrown around, I believe, far too much in fandom and in media discourse in general these days. And the word is both extremely broad and extremely absolutist in how it is meant. Broad because it can be applied to just about any character, whether or not that character is in need of redemption or not. For instance, by the vulgar fandom idea of redemption, Luce is redeemed because she started off a little shallow and a little rather myopic about the effects her actions have on others, and as she grows and matures throughout her time in the Boiling Isles, she understands the world from a broader and more comprehensive perspective, and so learns to move beyond this earlier narrow conception of herself and her surroundings, while still holding on to the nerdy optimism that is so indicative of who she is and all the best qualities about her. But I don't think anyone in the clear, thoughtful light of day would call that redemption, because it isn't, for one. Redemption implies some terrible lapse that needs to be corrected, and that's not the case for Luce. And it is absolutist because it implies this total transformation, this 180, so to speak. Absolutist in that it emphasizes that a character must be 100% more or less spotless and pure-hearted by the end of their redemption, or it doesn't count. And I don't really think this is a particularly useful conception of the term, because it applies more to these absolutist, totalizing, essentialist ideas of transformation instead of the rocky and nuanced process the transformation innately involves. For instance, even in a case like Zuko in Avatar The Last Airbender, a case that is commonly cited as this archetypal idea of what the redemption arc is, Zuko is still flawed somewhat by the end of it, because the show is honest, because it does not project this idealized perception of who Zuko is and who he has become, even as he undergoes quite a radical transformation. The comics especially go much more in depth into questioning who this new Zuko is, what ideas and convictions he holds, what values are most important to him. So, when we say that the collector might be redeemed, in a sense, I do not want to engage in the coarsening of the discourse by the overbroad use of that term, redemption. I want to use it properly and concisely. Is the collector in need of a sort of redemption? Well, sort of. He never participates in anything that requires real active malice, any real disdain for others, with the possible exception of Belos, where his disdain is completely justified. At the same time, his negative effects on others need to be understood and need to be truly internalized if he is to ascend beyond his narrow, childish, myopic conception of himself and his surroundings and ascend toward a more broad and a more thoughtful and wise understanding of his social and psychological and political environment. And that's hard. To the extent that this is a redemption for the collector, though, it is as much a process of education. A process of taking a mind that is not necessarily and essentially cruel or callous and imbuing it with ideas and values that allow that mind to move beyond these wild, chaotic impulses into a more harmonious and concord-filled interaction with others. Now, for the collector, this process is, of course, quite extreme, because he is not merely this little kid who is a bit naughty some of the time. He has this almost godlike power that is particular to his apparently otherwise extinct kind, and when he misuses that power, even innocently, people can suffer. The other problem with a lot of the focus that fandom so often places on redemption these days is the mechanization of the process, which is a bit funny because the foremost example that is often mentioned, again, Zuko, is fundamentally non-mechanistic, non-linear. It is not simply a process of, oh hey, this person is bad, and then thing X happens, and then they suddenly understand that they were wrong, and they do thing Y to make up for their mistakes. That is a boilerplate, rather staid, rather superficial concept of redemption, and yet it is a surprisingly common one. Zuko, his story works because it is a story that requires many layers of contemplation and reconsideration. He goes the entirety of Season 2 slowly and curiously learning that he was wrong about a lot of his assumptions about himself and his nation and the ideology of that nation. He sees very particularly and very viscerally the negative impacts his nation's imperial ambitions have on the people of other nations, and so he learns, and yet even with that learning, he makes the wrong decision at the end of Season 2, suffers the consequences of making that decision, ascends practically and politically in his society to a place of, not to be too blunt about it, honor, and realizes that that honor is false, that it gives him no personal fulfillment and meaning, and so he eventually needs to turn away not just from that position, but from the entire ideology that led to him desiring that position, and try to forge a new conception of what he wants for himself. So, the Owl House does have a tendency to have a lot of these transformations. Basically, every character except Baelos that is presented in a more negative light ends up being presented in a more positive light by the end of the show. You see someone like Amity, who is the best example of this. She started out very insecure and very presumptuous and arrogant. With Luce's help, she's able to ascend beyond the restrictive and authoritative dictates of her parents and decide for herself that she does not want to be the kind of person they want her to be. She becomes different. Hunter goes through a similar process. And honestly, I like the Hunter story a little better even than the Amity story because it is a bit less straightforward. Hunter gets a sense of meaning, a sense of validation from Baelos. Baelos makes him feel like he is special, and it is very hard for Hunter to reject the attention of Baelos and the praise of Baelos because it does make him feel good. But eventually, he has to understand that Baelos does not really care about him at all and turn toward Luce. And so he steadily works toward improving his relations with others, trying to nurture his basic instincts, which are mostly good, and try to understand himself and others better. The collector does not have the amount of time in the show needed to go through the same process that Hunter goes through, a process that takes several episodes, a process that is a real sense of change, a real sense of transformation. This is the last episode of the show. I don't want, then, the collector to have this complete turnaround. I just want him to have the opportunity to think beyond his childish perceptions of himself and the world around him, to realize that other people matter too, and he will be happier in the long run if he considers what they think. I hope that they are able to do the collector's transformation, if they are going to do it, in a way that is not simply, oh hey, he was bad, he learned this important piece of information, and now he's good. And this goes right along with what I was talking about in terms of education. The old process of education, the traditional process, is the one that the great pragmatist philosopher and education theorist John Dewey, among others, refers to as the filling up process. As in, there is a specific amount of information that a child needs to learn to become an adult, and you kind of pour this information into the child like water into a glass. It's a very teleological and mechanistic process. Dewey is quite opposed to that. He is far more in favor of processes that allow the child to be an active participant in their education process. The phrase that is so often attached to Dewey is learning by doing, but that is a phrase that has become so overused that its original meaning has been lost to an extent. It does not just mean, hey, we should do projects instead of memorizing these lists of facts. I mean, it does mean that, but it means a lot more than that. It means engaging critical thinking skills. It means really asking the child to think about why they are learning what they're learning, what purpose it serves them. Not a mere utilitarian practical purpose, not what purpose does it serve you in making money, but what purpose does it serve you as an individual in extending beyond the narrowness and the insularity and the narcissistic self-focus that is common to children into a more community-oriented, more socialized idea of how to live and how to be an active citizen and an active agent in your own continual education even after you leave school. This broader concept of what education is and what educating the wild and rambunctious entails is what I believe the Owl House should be focusing on with the collector. The collector is not just in need of some trite moral knowledge. He does not need a bunch of abstract dictates. He does not need a bunch of facts to memorize. What he needs is to realize that he will be able to benefit himself and others if he stops merely pursuing his caprices, his individual transient desires, and instead considers what would be best for not only him but others, that the interests of the self are not this wild machine that needs to be fed at the expense of others, that others are not the enemies of the self that need to be crushed in order to fulfill the foremost desires of the self in some pseudo-Nietzschean sense, but in reality, that true fulfillment, and this is essential to what the Owl House has always been saying, comes from finding a sense of love in unexpected places, a sense of warmth, a sense of community, a sense of people who are willing to support you and be there for you. I hope the collector is able to come to a sort of realization like that, and I hope the show is able to do that in a way that does not feel cheap or sentimental. So anyway, thank y'all for watching. If you liked what you saw today, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Donate to my Patreon if you can, and do you want to see more videos like this. The show is almost at its end. Only one more episode to go. I think it will be a very good one. I'm not really worried about the show, but sound off in the comments if you are. I want to hear what you think. Anyway, tune in soon for the next analysis. It will be coming soon. Promise you that. Thank you all again. Adios, comrades.